Hello, hello, hello. Now, just 8 days before the Prime Minister and his advisors partied in the grand gardens of number 10 Downing Street, a 45-year-old homeless man was hauled before the courts for violating lockdown restrictions. He'd been arrested at Liverpool Street Station. There are other egregious examples. I don't know, the carer in Somerset, who, after looking after one of her clients, made the cardinal sin of having a sandwich in her car in a beauty spot. She was fined £200, reduced to tears, unsurprisingly, applauded by politicians amongst them from doorsteps, balconies, for her great sacrifice, underpaid like carers tend to be, and then fined £200 for having a sandwich. All in all, more than 100,000 fines have been handed out to people in England alone for an assortment of offences. Not wearing a face covering to mixing with people outside of your bubble. Needless to say, these fines were not evenly distributed. Black people up to 7 times more likely to be fined by the police for lockdown breaches than white people. Of the total number fined, 371 have been slapped with the maximum fine of £10,000. What for? Wait for it. Hosting gatherings of more than 30 people. Now, that sum of money, £10,000, if you're earning something like, let's just pluck a random figure out of the ether, shall we? Just as a little experiment. If it was, say, £161,401 your salary, the Prime Minister's salary, by the way, that's nothing. You can afford that. But for most people, in a country, of course, where 2/3 of the UK population carry personal debt, 10,000 quid is financially ruinous. Now, what do we know? We know that the Prime Minister broke the very rules, the laws that he and his own government imposed on the rest of the population to protect us from a virus which, thanks to the government's mismanagement, has killed well over 150,000 of our fellow citizens. But the way, as in the great tradition of the British state, those laws have been implemented, same with the war on drugs, same with the way the state clamps down on benefit fraud but allows so many legal loopholes for people to exploit at the top of society if they wish to avoid tax, for example, the state cracks down on its traditional marginalized communities, poor, working class, people of colour, whilst, as we see here, those at the top have been allowed to behave with utter impunity, having parties while so many others have suffered. Now, we're going to talk about this at great length, but what I want to do first is we've got Ellie Mae O'Hagan, the director of class and a very good friend of mine, to talk this through. I'm going to, just before I bring in Ellie as well, just a bit later on, just go through some, because we're being gaslit, we're being lied to by the Prime Minister, astonishing. So it's very clear that we have clarity about the facts. But what we're going to do first is we're going to bring in Jolyon Maugham, who is from the Good Law Project, who we're very honoured to have joining us. Here he is. I can see him here. Let's bring him in. Hey, Jolyon, how you doing, mate?
I'm very good, thank you. It's been a long day. I just escaped from parents' evening.
Of course, doing your doting fatherly duties.
I am a very doting father. It's almost tragic, but it's true.
Now, Jolyon, I'm going to talk later on with Ellie about just wider stuff. There's a couple of specific things with your precious time that I want to talk to you about. Now, I think one rule I would very much advise people to abide by is do not piss on the chips of the Good Law Project. Because now, I mean, if the government, I would say, not to get too graphic, have clearly soaked the chips of the Good Law Project with bodily fluids. Let's just leave it there. Let's just see what's happened in terms of what the Good Law Project. This huge win, and this is what we're going to talk about with Ellie. I'm going to talk about the party and the huge fury and anger across the country. But even though it's understandable that people are more angry about Partygate, I think in a very real sense, this is a bigger scandal because this is about the corruption of the British state. So the High Court's just found the government PPE VIP lane for politically connected supplies was unlawful. Once again, another win for the Good Law Project. They must hate you by this point. Just explain What was the case and what's been found?
So in October, we uncovered the existence of a VIP lane. We were leaked some private government documents, which we published. We couldn't get any of the media actually to pick them up. Everyone was so startled at what the documents seemed to show, which was the institutionalization of a special regime that applied to those who the National Audit Office found were overwhelmingly referred by the offices of ministers. Putting it more briefly, if you were an associate of a minister, and you might be an associate of a minister because you're a pal or you're a donor or you have shared business interests, you got put into a special lane and you got treated differently. And what the National Audit Office later went on to find was that you were much more than 10 times more likely to win a PPE contract. So we found this stuff in October 2020. We published it. We couldn't get anyone to pick it up because it just was astonishing then to the media that there would be a kind of institutionalization of party privilege in the handing out of substantial sums of money. I mean, very, very substantial sums of money. So Private Eye, I think, have indicated that, and they've seen materials, I haven't seen materials, that on one transaction, it's something like 80 million quid of profit was made and this was a transaction through the VIP loan. We were pretty startled by this. We brought a series of procurement cases, some of which are still working their way through the courts. But what the court held yesterday was that the VIP lane was not only immoral, not only unethical, but also illegal. And we see that as being a vindication of a very long campaign that Goodwill Project has fought, both in the public domain and in the courts.
Is this corruption?
Corruption is a funny word, actually. It doesn't really have to a lawyer, it doesn't really have a term of art meaning. I think I would say that corruption is whenever a public servant allows private interests to interfere with her or with his exercise of their duties as a public servant. Looked in that way, bearing in mind that the architects of the VIP lane gave unfair advantage to those referred into the lane by overwhelmingly by the offices of Conservative Party ministers, I think it can be described as corruption, meeting that definition. I mean, there's another way to look at it as well, which is that the National Audit Office also identified that there was and here I quote, a high risk of fraud in PPE pandemic procurement. I mean, there's a VIP lane we uncovered for PPE, and £12.5 billion was spent on PPE, albeit not all through the VIP lane. There's also a VIP lane for test and trace, and £37 billion was spent on the test and trace debacle. So that's a total of 50 billion quid, 2 VIP lanes. We don't know how much of that 50 went through the VIP lanes, but it will have been in the high single or double digit billions. Very, very substantial sums of money have been spent in a way that prefers associates of the Conservative Party. And, you know, I think that is quite staggering stuff. I mean, the reality of the situation is this, really. One of the reasons why we have elaborate processes around the spending of vast sums of public money is because human nature is what it is. And when vast sums of public money that can, to some people, feel ownerless, In other words, if I get some of it, it doesn't come out of anyone's pocket, so it's not really stealing. When vast sums of public money are flying around, you need a careful process to secure that it goes, or at least it has the highest chances possible of going to the right place. In a pandemic, inevitably, you cut the process to achieve speed. You decide that speed is more important than protecting against fraud. And fraud is inevitable. And I think all of that is true. But what's really shocking to me about what's happened in the UK is that although several bodies in government have said that there is, well, one says there's a high risk of fraud, the other said they couldn't rule out fraud in PPE procurement, nobody has bothered to look. No one has thought to ask the question, no one in authority at any rate, whether prosecutions should be brought. So, there's fraud in Germany, there's fraud in the States, there's fraud in Italy around pandemic procurement. Fraud is what happens when you put aside those safeguards. But as far as I'm aware, it's only in the UK where our establishment has turned a blind eye. I mean, in a funny way, that's the thread that draws together the two big stories of yesterday, the Met turning a blind eye to the criminality, as I also see it, of the Prime Minister, and the establishment turning a blind eye to criminality in the procurement of pandemic PPE.
That's the other thing I wanted to ask you about the police. I mean, just quickly on what you said about a PPE crisis. Never again should any government treat a public health crisis as an opportunity to enrich its associates and donors at public expense, which of course is exactly what's happened. Whatever people label that, that is a very succinct and damning description of what's happened. That's the other thing I wanted to talk to you about. So not long before we start this conversation, the Metropolitan Police have issued a statement which essentially makes it clear that they don't think there's enough evidence. They don't think there's enough evidence. Sorry, I just need to compose myself. They don't think there's enough evidence to investigate whether the Prime Minister has broken the rules when the Prime Minister obviously made a statement which, however gaslit he thinks the nation is, makes it clear he broke the rules and his officials broke the rules. Now, the Metropolitan Police, I mean, why should they have known what was happening in number 10 Downing Street? It's not like they've got several police officers parked there. As I noted before I started speaking to you, the police could be pretty zealous, overzealous with how they enforce lockdown rules. The Crown Prosecution Service found 3 in 10 cases had been incorrectly charged. They charged homeless people. They charged children, which was actually against the law. Now, given they were disproportionately, again, black people up to 7 times more likely to be fined. So they went for some of the communities, let's be honest, who were traditionally over-policed and harassed by the justice system. And yet there's no evidence, they say, to investigate not just one party, not two, multiple parties, including the Prime Minister. What the hell is going on? How is this possible? And what action have the Good Law Project taken?
Yeah, there's a kind of fin de siècle to the end of 2020 if you're lucky enough to be working in Downing Street. They seem to have had more parties during lockdown than most of us get to go to in a normal year. What on earth were they doing? How did they find time to manage the pandemic? Maybe they weren't managing the pandemic. I mean, the Met's position is quite extraordinary because all of the facts that we need to determine whether or not a crime was committed on the 20th of May party are now in the public domain. The Prime Minister's admitted he was there. We know that about 30 people were there. We know that it was a bring your own booze occasion, trestle tables heaving with food. The only question is a question of law. Does that amount to a criminal offence? And I haven't looked at the legislation, but people who have seem to be unequivocally of the view that that is the commission of a criminal offence. But there's no deficiency of evidence. The only question really is one of legal analysis of the evidence. So I scratch my head at that. I also scratch my head at the notion, which seems to have crept into the Met's understanding of all of this, namely that their job is otherwise than gathering evidence. So, they're not the Crown Prosecution Service. It's not their job to assess evidence and bring a prosecution. They sit before that in the process. Their job is to gather evidence and put it before the CPS, and the CPS decides whether or not a prosecution should be brought. So they seem to be completely abrogating the role that the justice system, the criminal justice system, gives to them. And then, if all of that wasn't bad enough, the reality of the excuses that the Met have given for not investigating strike profoundly, or at least as I see them, at the notion of equality before the law. If you look at the Old Bailey, there's this great big gilded statue on top. The statue is of Lady Justice. She's holding a sword to indicate the sort of magnificence of the law, and scales to indicate that the law applies equally to everybody. And lots of other depictions of Lady Justice show her blindfolded. She does not care. She does not know who is before her. She applies the law equally to everybody. But the position that the Met is taking is extraordinary. So the Met say that because the Prime Minister's subordinate is carrying out an investigation, they, the Met, don't need to. But imagine if the Met knocked at your door, Mr. Jones, it's been reported to us that you committed a criminal offence, and we need to ask you some questions. Imagine if you said to them, don't worry, one of my interns is carrying out an independent investigation to the matters that you put before me, so you don't need to take an interest. My intern will report to me, and I'll report to you in due course. And then if the answer is that my intern thinks I did commit a criminal offence, you can take action. I mean, the Met would laugh at you, and they'd be right to laugh at you. So I don't understand how the Met can think that the involvement of Sue Gray gives them an excuse not to investigate. And the other answer that the Met have given to us is almost worse. The Met say, well, we've spoken to Number 10, and Number 10 assure us that no rules were broken, so we're not going to investigate. Same hypothesis again. The Met knock at your door, Mr. Jones, we think you may have committed a criminal offence. We'd like to ask you some questions. We'd like to look in your wardrobe to see if there's any stolen goods there. Don't worry, officer. I can assure you no rules were broken. You do not need to investigate. All right, says Plod, and off he trots. I mean, it's bizarre. And it's worse than bizarre, really, because what we're seeing is the application of one law, one regime to those who are influential, who are powerful, who are running the country, a different regime to the regime that applies to everyone else. And that's the point, really. It's the same point as in the VIP lane. And it's also, bizarrely, the same point as in another strand of work the Goodall Project's working on at the moment, which is Clause 9 of the Nationality and Immigration Bill, where government is creating a separate legal regime for those who have dual citizenship or may have dual citizenship, so their citizenship is contingent. And everywhere you look, you seem to find this institutionalization of privilege for the powerful.
Jolyon, that was a real masterclass. Obviously, if I was accused of a criminal offence, I would just blame Ellie Mae O'Hagan, and I think that'd be pretty convincing. But that was a masterclass, which again, this just shows how critical the Good Law Project in terms of the work that you've done, because what you are doing is challenging these huge inequities, which, as you know, much of the media has ignored. You've ploughed on regardless. You've taken the government through the courts, and you've won, and you've exposed these horrific injustices. Fingers crossed with the Metropolitan Police, you have similar success, because again, what we see here is the Metropolitan Police coming down, crashing down on the backs, often in the most disproportionate way, of some of their usual targets, if we're honest, whilst washing their hands of any investigation of the way the people at the top have behaved who designed the rules. But that was brilliant. So well explained. What everyone must do, if you're watching this or listening to this, go and support the Good Law Project. I think if you just Google Good Law Project support, is that right?
Goodlawproject.org.
Yeah,
Thanks.
Good Law, but yeah, but I mean, just go to goodlawproject.org and just get whatever you can for everyone, because their work does depend on the support of ordinary people, whether it be fighting for trans rights or taking on the British government. So thank you so much, Joe. Honestly, that was brilliant, and I will speak to you soon.
A pleasure. Thanks, Owen. Bye for now.
Before bringing Ellie, usual housekeeping. Do click through if you're watching live. Click on the YouTube link. Press like. Good for the algorithm. Come on, get the algorithm going. Press subscribe so you can just know when these videos are happening. Handy. Do support us on patreon.com/OwenJones84. I am in Barcelona, so we're not doing documentaries this month, but we will be doing way more of them because of your support. That's why we've done all the documentaries we've done. But also, you super chat. I'm going to go through the super chats with your questions, and I will read through them at the end. And also download our podcast. Woo! Right, I'm going to bring in Ellie Mae O'Hagan, who I've left waiting. Hi, Ellie. Come on in. Come in, the water's warm. Hello.
Hi.
I like your snazzy little sort of.
What are these?
Yeah, people. What these little things? Describe what they are for people who might be listening on the podcast.
They're just I have like a glasses chain, but it's made out of fabric and it's stripy. Yeah. I was talking to Faiza Shaheen about this today, and I contend that I look like an old lady, but she says I look like an intellectual. So I'll take her position on that.
I think you've always got a lot of intellectual gravitas, whether you're wearing glasses or not. Now, Ellie, what are you doing first? Don't worry about it.
Can we just discuss briefly? I just want to know soaking the chips of the Good Law Project in bodily fluids.
Yeah,
I just want to note that happened. That sentence left your mouth.
Yeah, why not? Just register it. Yeah, fine. Move on. What's your issue? Yeah, say what you see. Yeah, that's what I said. Anything else? What, do you want to have a fight about it? Do you want to fight me?
No.
we can have a massive fight right now, right here, if you don't like
I'm in London and you're in Barcelona. I could come to Barcelona.
Come to Barcelona. We'll have a fight in the streets. Not after 1 a.m. because of the curfew. And we've got to abide by the rules.
At 12:30, we'll go to town.
Yeah, we'll go to town and then get arrested for breaking the COVID rules. And then everyone will be like, you're a massive hypocrite doing a big show about Boris Johnson breaking the rules. Then you went to Barcelona and broke the rules.
Yeah, but maybe it'll be worth it.
Maybe it'd be worth it. Let me just go through the chain of events, because we're going to talk. We've got a lot to talk about. Let's just talk about just because we're being gaslit by Boris Johnson, which is kind of annoying, really. So, firstly, what he did, right, is Boris Johnson denied there were any parties. He said there wasn't any. What are you all talking about? And then what he did is he said if there were any parties, then no one broke the rules.
What I can tell you is that all the guidelines were observed, continue to be observed, and what I can also tell you is that we're getting on with the job.
You lying little... So there we are. There's Boris Johnson. That was December. Then what he said, because then he was furious when he found out what was going on in his garden, in the house he lives in, and going on in the house he lives in and in the garden. So he went to the House of Commons last December when this was all kicking off.com, and he threw Allegra Stratton under a bus.
Mr. Speaker, may I begin by saying that I understand and share the anger up and down the country at seeing Number 10 staff seeming to make light of lockdown measures. And I can understand how infuriating it must be to think that the people who have been setting the rules have not been following the rules, Mr. Speaker, because I was also furious to see that clip.
Sorry, it's just so weird. I can't even. So yeah, he did that last December. So then obviously it turned out Dominic Cummings, who's obviously trying to bring the Prime Minister down, we'll talk about that, who then focused on, brought up this other party which took place on the 20th of May, which Boris Johnson went to, with Carrie Symonds, who apparently had a glass of gin in her hands. This is what he said to the House of Commons.
Mr. Speaker, I want to apologise. I know that millions of people across this country have made extraordinary sacrifices over the last 18 months. I know the anguish that they have been through, unable to mourn their relatives, unable to live their lives as they want or to do the things they love. And I know the rage they feel with me and with the government I lead when they think that in Downing Street itself the rules are not being properly followed by the people who make the rules. And though I cannot anticipate the conclusions of the current inquiry...
I'm just stopping it. It's too annoying. I'm sorry. I just got too annoyed. So we just for
when
our
it
own...
started, I literally was like,
it's too much. It's too much. What I'm going to start with, I'll just put the last clip, not Boris Johnson. I'm just going to treat everyone. Everyone's blood pressure is just going to go blah at the very beginning. We'll bring it down because we're going to start with what I started the show with. This is what, let's just listen to what Joe Gibbs-Mogg said. Sorry, everyone. I'm really sorry about this.
Now, one cannot hear these stories without grieving for people who suffered. And this was decisions that were taken at the beginning of the pandemic that affected people up and down the country, and they were very hard. And we must consider, as this goes to an inquiry, and we look into what happened with COVID, whether all those regulations were proportionate or whether it was too hard on people.
So the new... Sorry, you shouldn't laugh. You shouldn't laugh. This is very serious. So his new tack is to go, well, maybe he did break the rules, but the rules were pretty bad. They were quite intense. Could you expect us? It was difficult to abide, but they were too harsh. Now, that might be all well and good to have a little retrospective debate about the rules the government drew up and the government imposed on the British population. Not a bit late for the 100,000 people who got fined and the working class people and disproportionately black people who got obviously charged and faced criminal prosecution for breaking those rules. Well, I mean, let's just go through it because that's what this really shows, doesn't it? I mean, it really just it exposes how the British state works, doesn't it?
well, yeah, I mean, but you don't even like, of course, that, you know, the police disproportionately target black people. We know that. We know that is it 9 times more likely to be stopped and searched if you're black? So we know that
depends on the police force, but yeah, in London.
Yeah, but you don't even need to go that far. You don't even need to talk about that because in this government, Neil Ferguson also got fired. You know, you don't even have to talk about this as a social justice issue, which it is. You can just stop at talking about what happens within the government, because even that is crazy. Because Neil Ferguson got fired around the same time for seeing his partner in what would now be seen as a support bubble, which has subsequently become okay to do in lockdowns. I mean, he wasn't reinstated. And then the Scottish Health Secretary went to her second home with her immediate family, and she had to step down. So
Chief Medical Officer in Scotland, yeah.
Yes. So it's not, you know, before you even start talking about what it means for wider society, like, it's already crazy. And I think, you know, we've got to remember as well what that time was like, because I sometimes look back. I mean, I did think that some of the rules were bananas at that time. You know, when you had like Derbyshire police following walkers around with drones being like, we're watching you, and like the park benches getting taped up. You know, children's playgrounds.
Yeah,
like that was clearly wrong because you know, it sort of stopped people from being outdoors where it's actually safer. But you know, I think we should remember that at that time it was like everyone I know was following lockdown. I had friends who had like sores all over their hands from washing their hands and singing happy birthday all the time. You know what I mean? And like, even like, I remember going on a bike ride for my daily exercise and like cycling past a friend's house and knocking on his door and speaking to him like several meters away for like 5 minutes during that lockdown outside, like more than 2 meters, and then being a bit worried that I'd broken lockdown. You know, it was like, so I think if he'd have done it now, like, or, you know, when there was tier 3 regulations, or even in the winter lockdown, which was a bit less draconian, the schools were open, out, there was much more flexibility around being outdoors with other people, it might be less outrageous. But I think the difference between how we were all living, I mean, I did feel a bit like very policed in that time. When I went for a run around the park, you know, there's police horses everywhere making sure that you don't sit down.
Before, I remember going for a run down the canal where I live, and, you know, end up London Fields. And I remember, because it was very sunny, wasn't it, the first lockdown?
Yeah, thank God.
In London and large parts of Britain. And just people who were just sitting there, having actually gone for a run, being removed by the police. I remember.
Yeah. I remember seeing a woman sunbathe, and the police came over to her and made her go away.
I mean, it was literally illegal to sunbathe. If we're just going to go, and yeah, I mean, this is the thing, isn't it? Because you know, you did have. I'd say it was a very sunny time. You know, if you were middle class and you had a garden, you could go up. You know, you could sunbathe in your garden. If you're someone living in a tower block with 3 kids, no outdoor space, not a fun experience, I would say. For 8 million people who live alone.
Yeah, and this is it. This is where it does become, then when we start talking about where it does become a social issue, it was horribly unfair to people living alone who weren't even allowed to form a support bubble. And then, of course, it's going to, when you introduce draconian legislation that that gives the police a lot of power, of course, that's going to impact minorities, particularly young Black men in places like London, the most. Because they're already at the mercy of like a police system that I think is pretty rotten.
Yeah, because if the existing state apparatus disproportionately clamps down on Black people, working class people, poor people, there was evidence in Scotland, for example, where I've forgotten exactly by what order, but poorest communities were far more likely to have fines issued than in middle class communities, and so if the existing state is already classist and racist, if you then grant more powers, then by definition those powers are going to be literally imposed through the same racist prism. They're just heightened because there's less civil liberties.
Exactly. I think you're just giving the police free rein to do what they're currently doing even more. And, you know, in terms of what like Jacob, actually, I actually agree with Jacob Rees-Mogg that the rules were too harsh in the first lockdown, and that it was sort of prioritizing policing behavior over actually doing what's safe. There was no like scientific basis behind stopping a woman from eating a sandwich alone in her car, obviously.
And at a time when, I mean, we've all, you know, people on the left have argued all the way through that if introduce a proper statutory sick pay people can live on, because at the moment people don't self-hide. So people were going to work, obviously, at the time. They were going to work en masse in often badly ventilated offices or schools, because we didn't ventilate them and still haven't. And we didn't have statutory sick pay, and still it's one of the lowest in the Western world. So you got people driven to the workplaces, which were often unsafe, but then told they couldn't sit outside in a park. But it's all well and good, isn't it? That's the point. It's all well and good because the government drew the rules up, and actually, you know, and it was difficult for us a lot on the left to talk about this, or mostly on the left, because our view was lockdown as a general thing was imposed too late. So then if we started going, you know, we should have spoken more about these injustices. We did actually. It's forgotten about. But I mean, that is the point, isn't it? That the point is, Jacob Rees-Mogg's point is, you know, they're doing what they did over Owen Paterson, basically. You know, in a sense that
where someone breaks the rules and then they're like, well, maybe the rules are the problem, but like maybe they are, but how convenient. And I think, you know, I think for me, it's not that I think any of them have put people in danger, because they probably were all working together. I mean, I think, you know, there probably was more of a presence in Parliament of like people working together because it was a crisis, and, you know. So I sort of think they weren't putting people in danger. It's just like Ed Miliband said it on a Sky interview. He said, you know, he wanted to become Prime Minister So speaking as someone who was thinking about what he would do if he was Prime Minister, he said that he couldn't fathom the arrogance of it. And I think that's what I struggle with. It's actually not about whether they endangered people. And it's not about thinking that the rules were justified. I mean, some of them were, but some of them weren't. It's actually just it's the arrogance. I get, I'm, occasionally, not anymore because it's not really a lockdown, but occasionally, in the past, I've been asked to do something that doesn't follow the rules. And I'll have a meltdown about but I can't because the right-wing press, and this is the Prime Minister. It's I just can't. I mean, and what worries me is the impression that Boris Johnson and the people around him have that they can do this and get away with it. That isn't something that they're making up. That's something they've come to that conclusion because they've been shown that they're right, and that's the problem.
I mean, it's been much discussed, but I mean, I'll just give it a little clip. This is a woman in Northern Ireland who, one of many, obviously, whose relatives died and couldn't be with the relatives at the last moment.
We respected the rules. We understood the rules were there. They were there to be obeyed, and we did what we were told, and we stayed away from our mother. And she was on her own alone when she died. She didn't have any of us with her. It was bring your own booze, and I can't get those words out of my head today. Bring your own booze. As we did what we were told, stayed away from our mother, and family was everything to Mummy. It was her whole life was about her family, and we weren't allowed to be there to support her, to be with her, to hug her, to kiss her, to hold her hand, nothing. And meanwhile the party was going on strong in Downing Street, and I'm just disgusted with Boris Johnson and whoever else was at that party. I'm angry, and I feel betrayed. I feel let down.
Yeah, I mean, look, I watched two relatives buried on Zoom, and I'm not going to try and take too much kind of pity me, because people had, relatives who were much closer to them who they couldn't be with in their final moments. But in terms of, we're going to talk about, there's people I can see on the super chat, which I'll come on to, who want to know about the politics of this in terms of who's trying to get rid of Boris Johnson, which we will talk about. But before we come on to that, that's why this has cut through. This has cut through. People are genuinely angry. I can see we've lost Ellie there. She's sort of vanished. She'll be back. She's been thrown out by the security services. It's just me by myself. So while we're waiting for Ellie to return, which she will, in terms of, let's just look at some of the polling in terms of, obviously, this is... before we do, actually, I can see Ellie back. Ellie has returned.
Sorry, I don't know what that was.
No, it's just you walking out with me again.
I've had enough of this.
I did forget, actually, I should have shown the number 10 email, so I keep meaning to do this. The number 10 email, which makes it clear, not only it's a social event because it's bring your own booze, but it actually says official, it's official secretive. Wait a minute. Official sensitive, sorry. I was trying to peer onto my screen. The point is they were trying to cover it up. Let's be clear about it. In terms of the polling, that's what I wanted to show, because that's why this is cut through, because people suffered, and that's why they're angry. So if we look at voting intention, YouGov, the Tories have collapsed. It's a 10-point lead. Now, you can see, we'll talk about Labour a little bit at the end. Labour haven't actually really gone up there. So the Tories have just imploded elsewhere. And the polling underneath that shows a lot of those Tories have gone to don't know and not voting for now. If we look at the polling, obviously Boris Johnson now is on minus 36. Keir Starmer's on minus 18, and Rishi Sunak is on minus 6. Before we talk about who's trying to get rid of Boris Johnson, is he F-U-C-K-E-D? Do you think this is actually it? Because obviously the traditional thing with Boris Johnson is he defies political gravity. The usuals, he's just a walking scandal. The Tory MPs who, I guess why I'm asking if you think he's gone is, do you think now the public, including the people who did a certain demographic he did win over, do you think they're like, he's toxic now? And do you think the Tory MPs who put him there knowing that this person was completely unsuitable for high office, but were desperate to see off Jeremy Corbyn and Nigel Farage at the time, that's why they put him there, even though they thought he was a liar and a cheat and, you know, a despicable human being, a lot of them. They put him there knowing who he was. Have they now decided he served his purpose? We got rid of Corbyn. We got rid of Farage. We got Brexit done. What do you think? Is he over, or do you think he'll just actually manage to climb out of this one?
Okay, so there's a number of things here. So I think the first thing is, so when we talk about what happened with Jeremy Corbyn in 2019, a lot of people sort of say that the media and the establishment managed to turn people against Jeremy Corbyn. I think actually that's not quite true. I think what happened was the sort of media infrastructure of this country, combined with the political infrastructure, managed to create an environment where saying that you thought Jeremy Corbyn was a wally is how you showed that you were a sensible person. That was like signaling your good judgment, is like, oh, I'd never vote for that guy. It's not really that they didn't like him. They really didn't know. You know, I'm sure you experienced this on doorsteps when you asked people, do you like Corbyn? And they would go, oh, no. And then you'd say, well, why? And then they wouldn't really know why. Like, you know, it's not, so I don't think it's that they disliked him. I think it's just that this atmosphere had been created where that's what you say to show that you have sensible political judgment. And I think the same thing is starting to happen with Boris Johnson. When I look at when I think of family members and I think of my friends who are not political, you know, I have people in my life who for the first time are sharing political memes on Facebook and, you know, are messaging me about Boris Johnson. And, you know, I feel liberated to say Boris Johnson's a wanker to anybody and think that they'll either be like, yeah, or if they don't think that, they'll just keep quiet because they don't want to admit it. And I think that's quite interesting because, you know, I think the myth of Boris Johnson's popularity. The polls have never shown that he's like particularly popular. He's very polarizing. So people who love him, and people who hate him, like really hate him. Another similarity as with Corbyn, that's where the similarities end. I'm not doing the centrist thing of saying everyone who isn't centrism is the same. But I think what he did have was not popularity, but like that Teflon quality. You know, in the same way as like Trump has, which is, we've talked about this before, the honest liar. So people did kind of know what they were getting with him, but there was a certain sort of brazenness to him that made it feel honest, you know, that his lying was honest because it sort of came with the package. And something about that has broken down over the last, year, but particularly the last few months, as that has sort of broken down. It feels a bit like an Emperor's New Clothes moment. And I'm wondering, and the media also, there's some great journalists, obviously, but the media is a bit groupthinky in this country. And like when there's a narrative arc that goes through the media, they all kind of follow it. You know?
Well, on that, Adam Bienkov, he's a brilliant journalist. He used to be actually a lobby journalist. Is he still a lobby journalist? Anyway, he's a brilliant journalist. But a lobby journalist, for those who don't know, is those based in Westminster. It's their job to obviously be there amongst all the politicians. And he wrote this piece where he talked about essentially, you know, back then when he became prime minister, his actual performance as mayor was barely scrutinised by the British press or broadcasters, with almost all discussion focusing on his personal ambitions and rivalry with the then prime minister David Cameron. So when he re-entered politics in Westminster, the focus remained on those personal ambitions. His poor performance as foreign secretary barely touched upon. The result, he was swept into a position where it's abundantly clear, even to many supporters, that he's entirely unsuitable for. But as he says, if Johnson's ousted as prime minister by the same parts of the press that just 2 years ago lauded him as Britain's saviour, then questions need to be asked about exactly how and why this was all allowed to happen. And that is the point. The British media are actually at the moment doing their job. I mean, I know you said not all journalists, and you're right, there's some great journalists, but collectively there's been a terrible failure. Most of the press obviously support the Conservatives. But now they're doing it. It's almost like a switch has been flicked. Do you remember he did that weird rambling speech about Peppa Pig the other week? He's always done speeches like that. He's always done speeches like that. But all of a sudden, the media were like, oh, falling apart. Ooh. Yeah. That's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, there's a sort of semi-famous anecdote of, I think it's, what's his name? He's on Channel 5 and he's also got a Radio 2 show, Jeremy Vine.
Jeremy Vine! So I'm a Jeremy Vine regular.
I forgot a legend then.
I really like Jeremy Vine.
He's got this anecdote, you probably read it, about like he went to Boris
speech,
award ceremony, and Boris gave this extremely rambling speech as though he was forgetting what he was doing and he didn't really know where he was. And then the next day he came and did exactly the same thing. So it's like clearly part of his calculated persona. And I actually know someone who used to work for him, and she told me that he would like ruffle up his hair and be like before he goes on to sort of get himself into the character of Boris Johnson. And I think like the media, because like the media in this country is just so, I mean, that's for another show. But I just think they were sort of...
they won't lick if it's on the leg of someone with power.
Yeah.
Not all journalists.
Not if that person happens to be left-wing, though. Then they actually do their jobs and then some. But yeah, like
or a refugee or an immigrant or a Muslim or a trans person.
Then all of a sudden, sort of holding people accountable and also making up a bunch of stuff about them is, what they want to do. So, and I think, what was I saying? Oh, yeah, I think they were just dazzled by, like, the sight of him wearing Bermuda shorts on his first day as London mayor, or when he got stuck on that zip wire and he was like, had those Union Jacks. And, all this stuff was happening, like Garden Bridge. I mean, whatever happened, he never faced any consequences for Garden Bridge. There was like Boris Airport that he was, looking into at one time. There's the cable car debacle in London. And for those non-Londoners, you should read about this. Basically, London has a cable car, which is part of its public transport network that is like very, very high up and goes over a certain part of the Thames. And I read an article about it. It was sort of sold as a commuter thing. And I read an article that said it's something like, I might be exaggerating, so do Google this, but it's something like 9 people use it to commute. So it's like a total failure, a total waste of public money. The Garden Bridge is like, and for non-Londoners, the Garden Bridge is like a bridge that was going to go from, I guess, like Guy's Hospital to Westminster.
Quite literally a bridge too far.
Yeah. And it basically, have lots of like verdant trees and whatever. I mean, nice idea, but like when you've got so much poverty in your city, maybe you don't want to spend money on that. And I think like he was approached by a celebrity who wanted him to do it as well. And so, I think that kind of, I mean, where is the scrutiny of all of that? Like what happened there? We still don't really know. So yeah, he's just been getting away with this for years. And then there's the incident with him and that journalist that he sort of seemed to collude in getting a journalist beaten up.
But and still, you kind of think, because, you'd kind of think a lot of journalists might think, oh, he wanted to beat up one of our own. Turns out not. Just quickly, though, because I want to talk about the politics finally about of the people after him. I should just note, it's quite funny. A senior Tory MP texted a journalist, why does Boris need to isolate unless he himself has tested positive? He's had all his vaccinations, or does he not understand the rules again? That's because Boris Johnson's cancelled a trip because someone in his household has got COVID, supposedly. I don't believe anything Boris Johnson says. I would not be... I mean, people go, oh, conspiratorial, tinfoil hat. Literally do not believe anything this man says. But anyway, it's just very convenient. He can just cancel all public appearances. Let's just talk about... So Rishi Sunak did this tweet, which is really funny. I've been on a visit all day today, continuing work on our plan for jobs, as well as meeting MPs to discuss the energy situation. That's what he's talking about. Anyway, the PM was right to apologise, and I support his request for patience while Sue Gray carries out her inquiry. Now, okay, the thing about Boris Johnson, as I said, he was seen as someone who is not suitable for high office, but he had a purpose, because the Tories were genuinely scared of Jeremy Corbyn becoming Prime Minister, however much history is rewritten on that topic. They also thought losing support to the Brexit Party was one way that would happen. And they thought there was an existential crisis over Brexit. And, like the Corn Laws in the 19th century, which divided the Conservatives at the time. So he won an 80-seat majority. He got Brexit done. But it's not just they thought he's unsuitable. They don't really think he's a proper Tory, actually. They think he's too left-wing on the economy because he didn't do the Osborne, Cameron, slash and burn the states. And I have to say, a lot of the Tory Remainers, by the way, I know people are like, oh, they love the EU, so they must be progressive. A lot of them were to the right on the economy, and they hated Boris Johnson, partly because he wasn't in the whole slash the welfare state, supposedly from Boris Johnson's perspective to the ground and massive cuts. Instead, doing strategic investment in a very Tory way to shore up their new voter coalition. But nonetheless, it's not slash and burn economics. That isn't what he's done. He's increasing corporation tax, which defies traditional Tory ideology, increasing national insurance tax, aggressively done. We won't go into that. But also, a lot of them thought he was wrong to lock down at all. I mean, Rishi Sunak brought in lockdown skeptics over the autumn of 2020 to try and avoid a second lockdown. So isn't the danger, because do you remember people all cock a hoop over Theresa May's government falling to bits? I wonder how we look back at that now, because obviously Theresa May falling doesn't mean the Conservatives fall. In that case, something worse came along. And the golden rule of British politics over the last few years is, however bad you think things currently are, things could get a lot worse. And of course, that has been the history of the last few years. Is it possible a lot of the people behind this, Dominic Cummings being one of them, actually think, though his politics are bizarre, actually think Boris Johnson's too left-wing? They think he's, and it sounds ludicrous for what people watching and listening to this, they think he's too left-wing on the economy. So actually, what we'll end up with, potentially, is someone like Rishi Sunak. Now, whether that can shore up the so-called red wall, because those voters are not right-wing on the economy, which Boris Johnson has kind of understood, but will they do slash and burn economics? Will it just go back to all of that? What do you think?
I think first of all, there's questions that need to be asked about why this is all being leaked in one big dump. Apparently, see, that's what it seems to be like.
Well, it's kind of drip, 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 really, isn't it?
Yeah, but it's all come out drip, 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 sort of quite quickly. Like 18 months after it happened. And, I think we've also seen the leaks about Liz Truss's like £1,000 lunches as well, that as soon as she was rumoured to be putting her hat into the ring of Tory leader, that all of a sudden all of this stuff came out about her. And I think, a question that we need to ask is like, why is all of this coming out now and who is benefiting? I don't know the answer to that. I've heard it's people that vote Leave who are unhappy with Johnson, but I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, and a lot of them, though, are switching to don't know rather than to Labour.
Yeah, no, I mean, like the people who leave. I've heard that there's people who like are in the kind of original vote Leave coterie who are unhappy with Boris Johnson. That it's possibly them who leaked it. But just to be clear to your viewers, I don't know anything about Tory internal politics. I know very little about that. So that's speculation. But so I think we need to sort of say who is doing this and what are they hoping to get out of it. But, I think if I was Rishi Sunak, who I think is almost certainly going to be the next Tory leader if Johnson goes. And
the YouGov polling of Tory members suggests that ahead of Liz Truss, and a lot of headline, but also indicators when people are asked, who do you think this person would be better than Boris Johnson taking on Labour or worse? And Rishi Sunak has a really big lead over Liz Truss amongst Tory members on that.
Yeah, so I think it's, very likely. And if I was him, I would call a snap election, which I know is dodgy given that they're 10 points behind, but he will have a big honeymoon period because the press like him anyway.
He'll cut I bet he'll scrap the national insurance hikes.
Yeah, he'll be like, I'm the guy that did furlough. He'll probably do some campaign videos where he hangs out with people who were furloughed and like it saved their jobs, so he'll be like Mr. Business, he'll meet some businesses.
Some gullible liberals be like, come on, some of those gullible liberals who, to be honest, not all liberals, some liberals are fine, but there were certain types of liberals who, for them, politics is not really, it's more of a vibe. Like, they were all like, there was a certain chunk of them like, Jeremy Corbyn is a Brexiteer, we hate him, he's a Brexiteer. And then when Rory Stewart, who supported Theresa May's deal, came along, they were like, oh, Rory Stewart, we love you. You're always like it's like, who did Love Actually again? Who was behind it? Love Actually.
Richard Curtis.
It was a Richard Curtis film because they live in a Richard Curtis film, a lot of these liberals. So you get this nice little posho who comes up, and Rishi Sunak, they're like, he's a really right-wing person who campaigned for Brexit, but they love him.
Yeah, so, I think they could be like that about Sunak as well. I mean, it depends at kind of how.
Well, that's what I meant.
Yeah. And, they don't like the kind of very middle class liberals that you're talking about generally don't care that much about austerity. I mean, the fact that they like romanticize 2012 as like a wonderful time in politics. I was working in Tower Hamlets in 2012. And I had people come to I was working as someone who I helped people with benefit claims. I wasn't giving them advice. I was just trying to give them help. And I had people come into the place that I worked, and they were carried in because they had disabilities or injuries that were so bad that they couldn't walk, and they'd have their benefits cut, so anyway, that's a whole other thing. But basically, I think, he'll get a big honeymoon period from the press, who already quite like him. And I think he's distanced himself sufficiently from Boris Johnson, so that they won't be able to really pin all of this stuff on him. He'll cut the national insurance rises. He'll talk about how much he did furlough. He'll have all of these campaign videos like the ones that he's been doing. And Labour is not in a state where it can, if there's an election called tomorrow, I mean, there won't be, but you know what I mean? In the next month, say, Labour, or even in the next 3 months, Labour's not in a state where it can fight an election right now. First of all, it doesn't have any staff. No. And second of all, we'll get onto this, but Keir Starmer still hasn't decided what Labour is. And
just finally on that, because I need to wrap up shortly, largely because I've just realised people know I'm in Barcelona writing this book, but I'm actually interviewing someone very shortly. I've just realised for the book. I'm juggling. It's fine. But just let me wrap up quickly with this, because this is really important. Because as I've said, just quickly, in terms of Super Chat, people saying Tad Cantwell, it's probably fantasy, but could the fines for non-compliance be challenged in the courts if the PM and co are not charged as well? I wrote a column about this, which has just gone up, actually, saying we should have an amnesty. Kieran Buckley, Johnson definitely should be removed, but I'm more terrified of Rishi Sunak being Prime Minister.
Well, that's what I think.
And
I'm also
just quickly on that, Ed Jarvis also says, what does it say about society? The Hills are going to die. Who will replace him? What's with Moggs media rounds gross? Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. But just quickly on that, because you mentioned Starmer, I'm worried about running out of time. His favourability, because some of the Starmer people are like, oh, vindicated, 10 points ahead. Starmer's approval ratings are terrible. He's on minus 24 at the moment. He's preferred to Johnson, but cholera is preferred to Johnson right now. So probably COVID is, so that's probably a bit much. But so just quickly on that, because I realise I've got to wrap up. So yeah, do you think, because as I say, we both think, actually, I think some very right-wing elements could be behind this, and actually we could end up with something worse. But also, do you think, Keir Starmer's made the dividing line, his team, with the Tories over competence, with this blob who's technically Prime Minister at the moment? That kind of works. Doesn't work with Rishi Sunak. You need a vision.
Exactly. I think it's twofold. I worry a lot about Rishi Sunak's politics. I think he's a real free marketeer. Interestingly, he was brought in as Chancellor because he was an ally of Dominic Cummings. So that's interesting.
Yes, he is.
That's all changed. He was seen as really inexperienced.
We're still close to Dominic Cummings. They're still close. I think that's a key part of it.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, maybe Dominic Cummings will be back in Downing Street again. So then you'll have you might have, if Dominic Cummings is back, someone that uses social issues like trans rights to, create divisions. You probably will have the sort of horrible social policies of this government, but also austerity measures as well, which is definitely worse. But I think you'll also have someone who is not associated with this sort of sleaze that we're seeing, corruption, etc., that we're seeing now. Someone who is more popular. So essentially somebody who is more likely to keep the Tories in power.
But would Redwall vote? This is interesting. Maybe if he did it, maybe if he had an election sooner, as you're suggesting, then he could hide his Thatcherite ideology until after the election. Because a lot of Redwall supporters, even though the people who they won over the Tories to be older white homeowners, it's more complicated than people just saying they won over working class voters. Young working class voters overwhelmingly vote for the Labour Party, including in those seats. But amongst old, they're not economically right-wing. They're socially conservative. So I just wonder, could he keep that coalition together? That's what Tory MPs are worried about. They're worried neither him or Liz Truss have the cut through in those seats. But then there has been a long-term trend. Theresa May, there was a trend in those seats towards the Tories under Theresa May. So it's complicated, but I think
but he could run. I think he could run on furlough. I did furlough, and I'm getting rid of the national insurance hikes that tax on you, the ordinary people. He could kind of neutralize that. I think there is a wider question.
Johnson made me do it. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, yeah, the red wall, because sort of the kind of Tory base and the red wall. I think one thing that's interesting about them is that in the Brexit vote, 2 million people who normally don't vote came out to vote and they voted Leave. They didn't vote in the 2019 election, but they did vote in. Sorry, they didn't vote in the 2017 election, but they did vote in 2019. They're the ones that were queuing up at polling stations to vote in Boris Johnson because they knew that he would, like, they believed him when he said he would get Brexit done. And I'm wondering what they would do if Rishi Sunak was the candidate. I think that's an open question. But I definitely think that Rishi Sunak's got it in him to beat Keir Starmer in an election.
Well, they really would have to offer a vision then, wouldn't they? And they're just not, at the moment, it's just not there.
Yeah. So I think, you know, I suppose we're going to end here, and I would end with like a quote from Charles Bukowski, which is, if you're going to destroy something, you better make damn sure you've got something better to replace it with.
And as we saw when, you know, we could all look back and rejoice over Theresa May being removed. And then also
Priti Patel became Home Secretary. I mean,
and not only that, but actually, if we go back to Margaret Thatcher being removed, again, people do celebrate that. But actually, if she'd stayed on, would the Tories have won the 1992 election? Instead, John Major, who was seen as who was the Chancellor, by the way, seen as dull, not charismatic, grey. He had a grey spitting image puppet.
Yeah, I remember.
But they still they did win. And that is the danger for Labour, isn't it? That you could end up, I mean, we'll see, because I think there's question marks over. I spoke actually just quickly, because I can see the person I'm interviewing hasn't logged in yet, so that's why I'm striking this out. But I spoke to one of Keir Starmer's team a while ago. This was back in 2020, when actually Labour were doing quite well for a while against, you know, Keir Starmer had a kind of popularity bounce. And they thought Rishi Sunak would be a different proposition because he would go down not well in those red wall seats. And I think a lot of Tory MPs also think that the same, by the way. But he would be more likely to peel off socially liberal voters, which is bizarre. As again, it just shows how much politics is a vibe for certain people. So they thought places like Putney, which Labour is the only seat Labour gained in 2019.
On that wonderful night.
I campaigned there that day. I don't want to think about that. But, you know, those kind of voters who aren't, as you said, they're not economically on the left, a lot of them at all. So it'd be interesting because they, you know, his view was that's a different coalition. But we'll see, because you know, the issue with Labour is, you know, they told a lot. They keep telling them they've not won over until this point because people are pissed off. Even now, they're not winning over new voters. It's mostly Tories going to don't know. They're pissing off. They've pissed off. They said basically in battling Spain, we're not interested in our Muslim voters. Like, they can do one. Younger voters, they're just not offering anything for, but they're not winning over people. So that's the issue. Will Rishi Sunak, could the Tories win because Labour aren't?
I mean, yeah, I think he could if he like leaned into some of the stuff that he's done, you know, that is more economically progressive, like furlough, and, you know, he'll cut the NI. I do think he'll cut the NI raises. And I think the other thing about him as well is you've got to remember the Tories have lost 2 by-elections, the Lib Dems now. I don't think that would happen under Rishi Sunak. I think that's a protest. Like, I think that's those voters in those seats being turned off by Boris Johnson.
Are you saying that the charismatic leadership of Ed Davey isn't responsible?
I know, it's hard to believe as it is. I think I am suggesting that. Yeah, and also I think they're all there's a lot of liberal Tories in Scotland, and I think they're all about, you know, they're all expecting to lose all of their seats to the SNP, and like whether that would happen under Rishi Sunak. I mean, I don't know as much about Scottish politics as, you know, other people that you'll have on the show, but you know that, you know, when you've got someone like Ruth Davidson who was the former sort of leader of the Scottish Conservatives, it makes me think that maybe liberal Conservatives do better in Scotland. So
on that note, I better go and do my interview. It's very rude of me to just like to go, yeah, Ellie, stop. I've invited you on my show. Now shut up, I'm leaving.
We're way past rude, Owen.
We are way past the things Ellie's seen. What the hell? We'll just leave it there. Ellie, it was a massive honor as ever. Lots of love. We will speak soon.
Yeah, let's hang out when you're back.
We will hang out. We'll get very drunk and do all sorts of unpleasant things. Lots of love, and I'll speak to you soon. See you soon. I'm going to say quickly, because I've got to go quickly. Thanks to Kieran Butley, Tad Cadwell, Ed Jarvis, David Boriter. Thanks to everyone for listening. Do support us on Super Chat. Super Chat, you've already done that. Patreon, we'll do all our stuff. Press like, subscribe, listen to the podcast. We'll be back on Sunday at 12 o'clock. Lots of love, everyone. Bye.